if the downturn in the property market in China, which absorbs a very large proportion of steel and copper, is sharp, then we can have a very sharp decline in commodity prices. Second positive factor, capital flows. There are already growing signs of risk aversion among international investors. In fact, since summer 2011, there has been a massive outflow of capital from a number of emerging economies. If you look at these countries, with the exception of China, the red one is the exchange rates, the blue one is the equity prices. The equity prices have now all going down, including in China, and exchange rates are going down in all countries except China. We know why China cannot actually get their currency down against the dollar, being under pressure from the US. Now, China, for the first time since the 1997 crisis, experienced a sharp drop in its reserves at the end of 2011 for two reasons. One, a drop in exports, and two, a drop in capital flows. And this is quite unprecedented. Now, IMF has come down just last week with an outlook which argues that, which puts the global growth at 3.5%, but it's in PPP. If you look at the constant dollars, World Bank projections are much lower in constant dollars. IMF has a downside scenario, sharp decline of activity in Eurozone and increased instability in financial markets. In that case, the global economy will grow only 2% in PPP terms, but I expect it will be zero in current and constant dollars, maybe even negative. IMF also now recognizes that developing countries have passed their apex. Projections put China below 8.5% for the first time since 2002. India is downgraded to 6-7%, rather than going up to China-like growth rates that Indian policymakers were inspiring to do. Brazil seems to be going back to its historical average of 3%, and that's true for Argentina, Mexico, South Africa, Turkey, the major emerging or developing economies. Now, what to do? The space for counter-cyclical policy response in developing world today is much less than we had in 2008, 2009. Because of fiscal deterioration, current account deficits, everything is actually, macroeconomic balances are today much less favorable than it was in 2008. Therefore, policy space for counter-cyclical action is much less. But nevertheless, we need to do everything possible to avoid a sharp decline in the economic activity in the short term. That includes trade measures. I'm not in favor of cutting trade restrictions. Incidentally, when I started writing this section, I thought, hey, I wrote this before. And in fact, the first paper that will be in the book that is about the policy response to the 2008 crisis. And I didn't have to think anything new because it was all there, and the policy response, one of the first things was that we can cut non-essential imports, stop importing French cheese and Mercedes cars, and we can increase imports of essential food, everything. That is import management, not in aggregate term, and I argue that this will not cut the aggregate volume of imports, but change its composition in a way that it's conducive to growth and to catering the needs of the poor. Second, we need adequate international liquidity provision, as we did in 2008 and 9, non-conditional, period. Unconditional, particularly macroeconomic conditionality. There should be no procyclicality. Now, any international lending provision should support income, employment, and trade in developing countries. It should not support creditors and investors in advanced economies. It should not finance capital outflows from developing countries. This is a line that we took in UNCTAD for many years. That, yes, we want international liquidity provision, but we want them to be used for imports, for growth, not to be used to pay back debt or to finance capital outflows. So we are now, or we will soon be talking about controlling outflows. 6 months ago, we were talking about controlling inflows. And I think we should be prepared to control outflows, exchange restrictions, capital controls, and if needed, temporary debt standstills. And such standstills should be supported by the IMF by lending into areas. That is, lending to countries who are actually in areas with respect to their private debt. This is the short-term policy response. And finally, rethinking development strategy. This is my last slide, Mr. Chairman. I think China is the only developing country which can act as a locomotive for the others. It's not the case for India, it's not the case for Brazil, for the simple reason that these are structurally deficit countries. For Brazil or India to provide stimulus to others, they need capital inflows. This is not the case in India. So it's not the case for China. So China can become an important market, important driver for the South. But first, it should reduce its dependence on foreign markets. This is agreed by everybody, including Chinese policymakers. The president made so many statements on that. Chinese consumer market is less than 20% of US market. And even though its income is half the US. And Chinese imports for consumption, direct and indirect, is 10% the level of income import for consumption in the United States. So China needs to consume. China needs to raise its consumption ratio from 34% at least towards 50%. I'm not advocating that they should consume as much as Brazil or the United States, 60, 70%, okay? But they can easily go. And China should also reduce its investment to manageable levels, okay? And that reduction will be accompanied by significant increase in the productivity in China, okay? Now, to become a major market, therefore, China should raise household income, lower savings, and increase import content of its consumption. China can also recycle part of its surpluses to developing countries in deficit, rather than putting in the US treasuries. I expand on this theme in my paper. I don't have the time to do more here. Latin America, and that's true also for Africa. For this region, there are two key determinants of economic growth: commodity prices and capital flows. In the case of Africa, it's aid. And these two key determinants are beyond the control of national governments. That's why they go up and down with the world economy, with the capital flows, with commodity prices. So they ought to break out of this dilemma. I mean, something that Prebisch mentioned, talked about several decades ago. And we're still talking in the new millennium about the same old problems. Latin America need to raise savings and investment. Brazil has 16% savings rate. That's the same for Turkey and some other countries. And the rich in these countries receive more as a proportion of GDP than the rich in China or India, okay? And they save half as much as those rich. So the main issue is how to get the entrepreneurial class to save and invest, to have a high animal spirit, as Keynes would say, as a major driver of industrialization. Unless you have investment, you cannot talk about industrial policy. So you've got to get your investment right first. This is also true for South Africa. So true for my country, Turkey. So we got to reduce our dependence on foreign capital. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't use external financing. Korea did. Even Japan did. But there's a degree of independence that you can retain while relying on international capital. And secondly, they help to get out of commodity sectors. Of course, it doesn't mean that you abandon the commodity sector and you start all over again in industry, but you've got to reduce the importance of commodity sectors in your economy, grow the manufacturing. But in reality, what's happening is now Brazil is betting on having more oil as a way out by offshore digging. India, I think India is a puzzle. We need to study it a lot more. We need to know a lot more about India. But what we know is that its industrial performance is poor, that India can grow and reach high income levels by services, that it was a myth is now accepted by most people. So India will really move from services to manufacturing, and main impediments need to be removed. Southeast Asia, Malaysia and Thailand, Indonesia, they earn more in commodity exports than in manufactured export. If you look at the trade figures, you don't see it. But for $100 of manufactured exports from Malaysia, they earn $30 because of high import content. From $100 export of furniture, they earn $85. So these countries earn a lot more from commodities now than from manufacturers. And therefore, there is a deindustrialization in Southeast Asia because they never went back to the kind of investment rates they had before the crisis. No country in Southeast Asia went to the kind of investment rate they had before the 97 crisis. Yes, part of it was bubble, not sustainable, but 16% investment rate, and 38% consumption rate in economies like Singapore are not really quite consistent with kind of a self-reliant economic growth. So all these are, of course, said easier than done. I'm not optimistic, or I'm not pessimistic, sorry. I just want to be realistic to avoid complacency. I think the South has the potential. And I don't think, and I never suggested that, all of what we've seen as success in the South is due to entirely exceptional conditions. But in some countries, some regions, Latin America, my own country, some parts of Africa, external factors have become much more important than domestic factors. And therefore, we need to improve domestic fundamentals related to growth if we really want to continue grow much faster than industrial countries so that we can reduce the income gap and eliminate poverty. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Akyuz, for that comprehensive introduction to the screen. I urge the floor not to be agitated. I allowed him to speak for long because he was the principal speaker. The following ones will speak for much less time because I mentioned that we should have contributions and perspectives from the floor. I will now invite Minister Lee to give a presentation because he has to leave, unfortunately. So he will give first and then
Dear Mr. Chairman, 谢谢你啊，桑吉桑娜 And I also want to express my congratulations on the previous speaker. Personally, perhaps I have attended more than 100 international meetings or discussions in my 45 years diplomatic career. But this is the first time for me to hear my country's name mentioned at one meeting so many times. So, my dear friend, Juan Akyuz, you must have created a record this morning. Congratulations. And in this regard, perhaps I'll have to cut short a little bit of what I'm going to say. I'm indeed pleased and honored to join all of you at this very important symposium sponsored by the very important international organization, the South Center. According to my personal observation, the international financial market continues to experience disturbances. International trade growth rate has dropped by a large margin, and the global economic growth has slowed down markedly. The prospects of the world economy in 2012 will still be pretty grave on the whole, with downward pressure and growing uncertainties. According to the latest figures available to me, released by the World Bank on January the 18th, the world economy will only grow by 2.5% this year and 3.1% next year. Plagued by low growth and high unemployment, the U.S. will see its economic growth at an estimated rate of 2.2% this year and 2.4% next year. The worsening European debt crisis is spreading to the core Eurozone countries and the banking sector. There has been a growing risk of a Eurozone recession, with its estimated growth rate at a negative 0.3% this year and 1.1% next year. Stimulated by the post-disaster reconstruction programs, the Japanese economy is expected to grow at 1.9% this year and 1.6% next year. Under the double pressure of inflation and the weak external demand, developing countries will see a further slowing of growth to 5.4% this year. In 2012, we will see continued sluggish global demand, fiercer market competition, more difficult international policy coordination, and more salient protectionist tendencies, all of which deserve our close attention by our South Center. Developing countries did not cause the economic and financial crisis, but they have suffered the most from it. The spillover effect of the debt crisis originated from developed countries. The inflections in international commodity prices and climate change have further undermined developing countries' efforts to achieve sustainable development and the Millennium Development Goals. In addition, due to insufficient resources worldwide and the lack of coordination among different mechanisms, the development environment for developing countries has worsened. Indeed, the most fundamental problem facing the world economy is inadequate development of developing countries. Against this backdrop, it is all the more important for us developing countries to strengthen unity and promote South-South cooperation so as to safeguard developing countries' interests. To this end, I have the following proposals, modest proposals to make. First, work together to uphold world peace and stability. The recent turmoil in some West Asian and North African countries have affected regional stability. This shows that we still have a long way to go before achieving durable peace and common prosperity. We should abide by the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, give full play to the core role of the UN and its Security Council in peacekeeping and peace building, and settle disputes through dialogue and consultations. We have to remain committed to multilateralism and cooperation and promote democracy in international relations so as to create a sound environment to achieve peace, stability, and prosperity. Second, make joint efforts to create a just, inclusive, and well-managed monetary and financial system to support global economic development and increase the voice and representation for emerging markets and developing countries in global economic governance. We should put in place an international free trade system that is fair, equitable, and non-discriminatory, stand against all forms of protectionism, and push forward the Doha Round negotiations to achieve its goals at an early date. Third, join hands to push forward the development cooperation agenda. There are only 3 years to go before the MDG deadline, but its global implementation seems to offer no reason for optimism. Time is running out. It is urgent to build a global partnership featuring equality, mutual benefit, and one-on-one progress, and urge developed countries to deliver on their commitments on financial aid, debt relief, and technology transfer so as to help developing countries, particularly the least developed countries, small island states, and African nations to achieve the MDGs at an early date. We call on all parties to participate in this year's UN Conference on Sustainable Development and push for concrete results in coordinating economic, social, and environmental development across the world. In this process, developing countries should continue to stick to the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and prevent developed countries from shifting their due international obligations onto others. And fourth, enhance solidarity and coordination in tackling global challenges. Over the years, a wide variety of cooperation and cooperation management mechanisms have been set up. The Group of 77, the Non-Aligned Movement, and the South Center have played an important role in enhancing South-South cooperation and strengthening solidarity of the developing world. We should continue to make concerted efforts in upholding the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and its Kyoto Protocol as the primary plenum, and striving for comprehensive, balanced, and positive results in the climate change negotiations. The international community indeed ought to set up food assistance, enhance grain productivity, and create favorable environment for agro-produce-related trade, intellectual property rights, and technology transfer so as to achieve a global food security. We need also jointly uphold global energy security in line with the principle of mutually beneficial cooperation, diversified development, and coordinated energy supply. Mr. Chairman, China has been making progress in its reforming and opening up endeavor in the over 30 years. In 2011, China, the GDP grew by 9.2%, making indeed a contribution to the recovery of the world economy. At the same time, however, we are soberly aware that China, with a large population, a pretty weak economic foundation, uneven development, and a low per capita GDP, faces increasing resources and the environmental pressure in its development. Now, more than 100 million Chinese people are still living below the UN poverty line. Our task in pursuing economic and social development is really daunting. As the largest developing country, China has made solidarity and cooperation with other developing countries the cornerstone of its foreign policy. We will always be a good partner and a friend of other developing nations. My country stays committed to the path of peaceful development, and we will continue to provide assistance to other developing countries within the realm of its capabilities. As a matter of fact, since 2004, China's foreign assistance has grown at an average annual rate of 29.4%. Mr. Chairman, Mr. E.D., dear colleagues and friends, the South Center, by giving full play to its role as a think tank, has contributed ideas and made proposals effectively facilitating cooperation among developing countries. China attaches great importance to the role of the South Center and cherishes its friendly working ties with the Center. We are ready to go on working unremittingly with the Center for solidarity, common development, and prosperity of the developing world we all cherish. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and all colleagues. And again, I wish all of you a happy New Year of Dragon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lee, for that geopolitical and economic backdrop to our discussions. And you have set a good example for the following speakers. Thank you very much. I now call upon Mr. Juan Somavia, Director General of ILO. Let's hear the working man's perspective of these questions.
Thank you, Mr. President. I must say that I'm extremely happy to have been invited to this table. I have to say that I have to congratulate the South Center for the magnificent job that you're doing in keeping these issues on the table, in deepening the analysis that can be made from a Southern perspective, and in occupying the space, and I will refer to this, the space that I think is increasingly available and increasingly necessary, that the thinking of the South begins to shape not just our defensive policies, but the type of world we want to see in the future, and I believe that the space is there. So I'm very happy to be here under your chairmanship, Mr. President, with Deepak and Ambassador Lee, former Minister Lee, and my good friend Yilmaz. You made a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much for that. Martin, and the friends on the table. I see Ruben's here, who has played such an important role. I just want to express that I'm extremely happy to be here. That's my point of entry. Let me say that I will begin by following some of the